I've got a great question for you, especially having read your book. I know how it turns out. Could you comment on whether the Supreme Court decisions are not always carried out by the government, particularly in regard to the settlements?
Well, we'll sit and wait. We have to figure out whether the Knesset is going to carry out the decision on the Tal law, which the Supreme Court recently overturned the Tal law, which is the legal basis of the deferments, the yeshiva deferments for ultra-Orthodox men. What will happen this summer when the law reaches its expiry date? Will the Knesset pay attention to that decision or not? Will the government evacuate the outpost of Migron, which is built on privately owned Palestinian land, or will it not, according to the orders of the Supreme Court and the decision given this February? Will it follow the orders of the Supreme Court to evacuate the 20 or so homes in the Ulpana neighborhood of the settlement of Beit El, again, built on privately owned land? This is straight out and out. This is your land, I build my house on it. It's as described by attorney Talia Sassoon in her critical 2005 report on the outpost commissioned by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon at the time. This is a violation of property rights. It's a violation of one of the basic tenets of the rule of law. And the Supreme Court has clearly told the government that they have to evacuate those houses and give the land back to their legal owners. We will see whether or not the government finally does this, or whether it gives in to the political pressure of the right-wing, the most right-wing elements in Netanyahu's coalition, and in order to maintain the coalition, ignores the decisions of the Supreme Court. I actually can't tell you how those latest decisions will turn out. I can tell you that if the government had been as firm in upholding Supreme Court decisions today as Ben-Gurion was after the Kol Ha'am decision in 1953, the Migron case and the Beit El case and the Tal law case would no longer be public issues in Israel, because the government would have already acted upon and carried out the Supreme Court decisions. It has put those things off. Recently retired Chief Justice Dorit Beinish has, while she was still Chief Justice, admonished the government for its failure to carry out decisions. And on one level, this says to me, wow, now I really know how to appreciate Ben-Gurion. And by the way, there's something I want to say as an aside here, which is that, like, looking at Ben-Gurion and what was going on there is part of what teaches me that you know people by their contradictions. And when somebody wants me to decide, was Ben-Gurion a Democrat or an autocrat? Was this good or bad? I say, yes. Okay, good Jewish answer. It was a totally autocratic thing for Ben-Gurion to decide that he was going to shut a communist newspaper because he didn't like what they said about him, right? And then the Supreme Court said, Mr. Ben-Gurion, you can't do that in a democracy. And he said, okay. I mean, think about newly created third world countries in 1953, all right? Forget that. Think about the state of Israel in 2012, okay? He accepted the court's authority as a basic element of democracy and carried out the decision. I'm waiting to see whether Mr. Netanyahu can live up to that standard.
And as you point out in the book, we're flying here without the benefit of a constitution that clearly delineates where the court's powers should exist.
Well, an old friend of mine who's a constitutional law professor in Israel once said to me many years ago that a constitution is only as good as the judges who rule on it, and that the Soviet constitution had great guarantees of civil rights. In the debate in 1949 in the Knesset on whether or not to adopt a constitution, Ben-Gurion, who was against it, his representatives pointed out that the democratic constitutions of Latvia, Hungary, and so forth had done very little to preserve democracy before World War II. I actually think that the American focus on a written constitution as such, as a guarantee of democracy, has more to do with American civil religion than with a realistic appraisal of what constitutions do. It's much more an issue of the judges and of the honoring the unwritten contract between the branches of government. The Kol Ha'am case took place without a constitution, and the current ignoring of Supreme Court decisions is also taking place without a constitution. The US decision that upheld separate but equal in 1896 took place under a constitution, and you could probably cite to me better than I could cite, or at least certainly there's experts in this room who could cite certain decisions of the US Supreme Court in recent years that don't seem like they really live up to the ideals of your most idealized version of the Constitution. So the Constitution isn't the issue. The issue is an underlying commitment to the values of democracy and within that of judicial review in order to protect the rights of the minority. And as I said, there are some really big tests in front of the government today, and I don't know what they're going to do, and I really pray that they make the right choice.
If a two-state solution is to happen, how many settlers do you imagine being displaced? Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? How will Israeli society respond to such an agreement and their response to the Gaza withdrawal? And also, how will the IDF engage in the evacuation?
The Talmud says that when the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to fools and children. This is too gray for one category, and I don't want to end up in the other category. So I don't know the answers to any of those questions. I know what the challenges are. The largest settlements are closest to the Green Line. Ironically, those are also the settlements that in which most of the residents moved there for because of financial incentives for larger apartments and a better quality of life, and would probably be the most willing to leave for financial compensation. The settlements that have to be moved in order to create a viable two-state solution are the ones that are deepest in and that are smaller, but also are the homes in general to the people who are more ideologically committed to staying put. I've heard some of those people threaten to use violence to prevent the army from evacuating them. I've heard some soldiers from the right saying that they would obey their rabbis and not their officers. And I can't predict to you which of those things will take place. It depends a lot on, A, how the negotiations go, and what choices an Israeli negotiating and a Palestinian negotiating team make in terms of borders. And then it depends on the choices made by settlers, and it also depends on policy choices. And it depends on the way that those policy choices are presented to the public. I can't guarantee that there won't be civic conflict in Israel over this issue. I hope that it can be handled wise enough that that won't take place. I deeply believe that Israel should not be held hostage by its most extreme elements on this issue.
If Israel desperately needs a peace agreement, how do you prepare populations to accept peace on both sides when they have been taught to mistrust each other for 64 years? Or a lot longer.
Yeah, it's probably longer than that, but it's tough. That's the first answer. And the second answer is we're dealing with politics, not geology, and that people do shift their opinions. As I mentioned before, I made Allianz in 1977. To be more specific, I arrived at the beginning of September of 1977. At that time, if you did a poll in the Israeli public on whether you'd be willing to give up the whole of Sinai for peace with Egypt, the answer was certainly a majority was clearly against that. And 2.5 months later, Anwar Sadat was standing before the Knesset saying, I'm willing to make full peace with Israel in return for the return of the entire Sinai. And if you did a poll the next week, at least my memory is, I don't have the papers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure of this, is that you had majority support for that. The biggest single thing in my experience that affects the broad middle on both sides. Okay, so let me define the broad middle. The broad middle is the people who really believe that we have to have peace and really don't trust the other side to make peace and don't think the other side wants to make peace, except that we can't go on with the way things are right now. They're very contradictory, they're very normal, and they're swayed by the way things look at the moment. And when it looks like peace is achievable, like there will be a safer future for my children, then people are willing to make greater sacrifices. And when it doesn't look achievable anyway, then they say, why shouldn't I demand everything? So, and then, I'll give you one other answer. couple of years ago, let's see, when was it the first time we went? 2002, 2003, my family went on vacation in Crete. And we're sitting on the beach in Crete, like 5 miles from where the last British soldiers were evacuated from Crete as the lights went out in Europe in 1940. And the beach is full of German and Italian tourists spending their euros like mad. And listen, I want to tell you something. If you read the history of Crete, as I did that summer, everything that the Israelis and the Palestinians have done is like a high school musical compared to the history of Crete between 1800 and 1945, first with the Turks and then with the Axis. I mean, it's just like, I mean, we don't even know, thank God, how to get cruel. Okay, and there's the German and Italian tourists sitting on the beach. So, I'm sure that those attitudes didn't change overnight after the end of the war, and it took a lot, and it took a lot of reorientation, but people can change.